On the morning they lowered the King of England into his grave, the woman who had held his heart for 12 years was admitted to the abbey. Not through the great doors, but through a side entrance. Her name was Alice Keppel. For more than a decade, she was the mistress of King Edward VII, treated by the Edwardian court as a kind of unofficial queen, courted by statesmen, worshipped by London society. And the instant that king drew his last breath, that same court quietly erased her from the record. A century later, the crown she could never wear would find its way back to her bloodline in the most unexpected manner imaginable. Her own great-granddaughter, Queen Camilla, would one day have that very crown placed upon her head. This is the story of the most influential woman in Edwardian England who possessed no title whatsoever, and the hidden toll she paid for a life lived so publicly. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. For those finding us for the first time, this is Crown Files. We explore the lives of women who dwelled in the shadow of power, the duchesses and heiresses, the queens, and those who were never quite permitted to become queens. The women history pushed to its margins, and the private cost they bore for lives lived in full view. Tonight, our story centers on a woman who, for 12 years, stood closer to the English throne than nearly anyone alive. And yet you will search the official histories of the crown in vain for her name. There stands no monument to her memory. No state portrait hangs in the long galleries. For most of the last century, her name was something the great houses of England preferred not to utter aloud. Her name was Alice Keppel. She was the mistress of King Edward VII, the eldest son of Queen Victoria, the man who lent his name to an entire era. In the salons of Edwardian London, she was regarded by many as a kind of second queen. Ministers sought her counsel. Hostesses vied for the privilege of her company. The king himself, it was said, could not remain at ease for long in her absence. Her own daughter, looking back across the decades, found herself at a loss to capture her mother in words. My mother began as an atmosphere. She wrote, luminous, centered with flowers, impossible to hold. To know Alice Keppel, even her own children discovered, was to stand in her radiance and never quite reach the woman who was casting it. And then, in the spring of 1910, the king died. What followed tells you nearly everything about the world she inhabited. On the day of his burial, so her biographers record, the woman he had cherished for 12 years was permitted to attend the service through a side door. Apart from the family, apart from the grief that was deemed proper to display. It is a small detail, a door. But hold it in your mind tonight, because this is the story of a woman who possessed everything and truly owned almost none of it. The houses, the jewels, the influence over a kingdom, the love of a king, none of it, in the final reckoning, was hers to keep. All of it rested on a single beating heart. And when that heart ceased, the life she had constructed around it ceased with it. There is more to this tale, and it is not gentle. For the daughter Alice raised would one day fall in love, deeply, recklessly, against every convention of her time. And Alice would deploy every weapon at her disposal to crush that love, all in the name of the very respectability that had carried her so far. The mother who had broken every rule would not permit her own child to break a single one. And there is the strangest turn of all, one we will reach only at the very end. How the throne that Alice Keppel could never touch would, 100 years later, be answered by history in a way no one in that vanished Edwardian world could ever have foreseen. But we begin where she began, not in a palace, in a cold Scottish castle, with a young girl her family called Freddie, long before there was a king or a court or a side door held open for her shame. Tonight, we tell her story, one chapter at a time. The castle stood above a loch in the west of Scotland, grey-walled and ancient, and it had belonged to the same family since before anyone living could recall. Duntreath. It was here, in the spring of 1868, that Alice Frederica Edmonstone was born. The youngest of a large family, the last of a long line of brothers and sisters, in a house where a small child had to learn early how to be seen. Her father was Admiral Sir William Edmonstone, a baronet and a man of the Royal Navy. It was a good name, a respectable name, but a respectable name in Victorian Britain was not the same thing as a fortune. And the Edmonstones, for all their stone and their history, were not wealthy in the way the truly great families were wealthy. Alice grew up in comfort on the edge of a world that measured everything in money she did not have. From the beginning, she stood close to grandeur without quite owning any of it. What she possessed instead was harder to quantify. Even as a young woman, people noticed her the moment she entered a room. She was tall, with chestnut hair and large, frank blue eyes, and a figure the age admired. But her true gift was not her looks. It was something quieter and far rarer. She had a genius for attention. She could make the person before her feel, for a few minutes, like the only person in the world. She listened. She remembered the names, the worries, the small vanities. She made anxious men feel clever and powerful men feel understood. And she did it so smoothly that they almost never noticed how carefully it was being done. In 1891, at the age of 22, she married. His name was George Keppel. Tall, good-looking, easy in company, the third son of the 7th Earl of Albemarle. On paper, it was a fine match. An earl's son, an old titled family. But George was a third son, and in the cold arithmetic of the English aristocracy, a third son inherited the manners of a great house and almost none of its money. By most accounts, he had charm and very little else. Little fortune. And as one of his own daughters would gently put it, little imagination. He was a kind man and a complacent one. He would prove in time remarkably willing to look away. So here was the shape of Alice Keppel's life, set early, long before any king ever walked into it. She had been born into a world of grand houses and great names. She had married deeper into that world, and she herself owned almost nothing within it. The houses she would live in would be rented or lent, or paid for by others. The grandeur around her would belong to someone else. Whatever she built, she would have to build on another person's foundation, with the only capital she truly possessed herself. She entered a society that understood this perfectly and forgave it completely. So long as the rules were kept, late Victorian and Edwardian high society ran on appearances. What a husband and wife did behind their own doors was their own affair. Provided no one was embarrassed, no one was named, and the surface stayed smooth and bright. Marriages were arrangements as often as they were romances. Debts were settled quietly. Reputations were managed like estates. And a beautiful, clever, discreet young woman could rise very far indeed in such a world. If she never once made the single unforgivable mistake of being indiscreet. That was the lesson Alice learned better than anyone of her generation. Discretion was not for her a virtue tacked on afterward. It was the foundation of everything. Questions would later be whispered about the parentage of her elder daughter. The kind of questions that hung quietly over a good many fashionable marriages of the day. But they were only ever whispered, never said. Alice gave the world no reason to say them aloud, and the world, grateful, kept its voice down. We know what it was like to live inside her light, because her two daughters wrote it down. To Sonia, the younger, her mother had a brilliant goddess-like quality. She remembered the bedroom most of all. The lace pillows, the chestnut hair unbound across the shoulders, and the flowers. Great beribboned baskets of orchids and lilies and malmaisons, carried in each morning by servants in livery, banked in tall cut, glass vases around the bed, delivered like offerings to something not entirely human. A child standing in that doorway understood, without ever being told, that her mother was the most important person in any room she chose to enter. The flowers, the scent, the warmth, all of it was an atmosphere her daughter could stand inside but never quite hold. The elder daughter, Violet, felt it too, and felt the weight of it more sharply. Measured against their mother, she once wrote, she and her sister could only make do and mend. It is a strange and sorrowful thing for a daughter to set down on paper that beside her own mother, she felt like something patched, second-hand, made over from a finer original. But that was the price of growing up beside a woman who filled a room so completely. Even the people who loved her most found themselves standing in her glow, reaching toward the woman who was casting it, and closing their hands on warm air. And this is the part the old society photographs never show. Behind the charm and the flowers was a woman of formidable intelligence. She was shrewd about money and sharp about people. She had a grasp of politics and of finance that many of the men around her plainly lacked. In a later age, she might have run something, a business, a great estate, a department of state. But she had been born a woman in 1868, and her world offered a woman of her gifts exactly one road to real power. Not through office, not through inheritance. Only through the men who could not resist her. She would walk that road further than almost any woman of her time. She would walk it, in the end, all the way to the throne of England. But she would always be walking it as a guest in another person's house. Admitted now through the front door, welcomed, adored, made to feel indispensable. The side door would come later. In the early years, no one could have imagined it. In the early years, every door in London was opening for her. By the late 1890s, the Honourable Mrs. George Keppel was one of the most sought after young women in London. She had everything the part required. The looks, the wit, the discretion, the gift of making the great feel greater for having been near her. She moved through the long calendar of the Edwardian season. The spring weeks abroad, the summers at Cowes, the autumn weekends in the great country houses, as though she had been made for it. And in a sense, she had. There was only one thing she did not yet have. The one man whose attention could change a clever woman's entire life. He was heavy now, and restless, and bored. He smoked too much and ate too well. He had waited his whole life for a crown. His mother showed no sign of surrendering it, and he filled the waiting with pleasure and with women. And in the early months of 1898, in a London drawing room, the bearded, impatient heir to the British Empire was about to be introduced to Mrs. Keppel. He would never quite recover. It was early in 1898 when they met. He was 56, heir to the throne of the largest empire the world had ever known, and he had been heir for a very long time. She was 29. Within a matter of weeks, not months, weeks, the thing was understood. Alice Keppel had become the favorite of Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. There had been other women before her, a great many. The prince collected them the way other men collected horses, and discarded them with about as much ceremony. An actress, a society beauty. A countess who made the mistake of letting the world see how much she enjoyed her position. But Alice was different, and the difference was the whole of her genius. She did not flaunt it. She managed it. She made herself, almost at once, not a diversion but a necessity. What she built with him was not a secret exactly. Everyone who mattered knew. What she built was something some subtler and stronger. A discretion so complete that the world was permitted to know everything and required to acknowledge nothing. The arrangement had a shape, and the shape was this. She lived at 30 Portman Square. The prince came to her there. in the late afternoons with a regularity that the household learned to anticipate. And when his carriage, and later his motor car, drew up at the door, her husband would already have found somewhere else to be. George Keppel did not make scenes. George Keppel took his hat and his coat and stepped quietly out into the London evening and came home when it was convenient to come home. Years later, asked about his wife, he is said to have answered with a shrug worth 1,000 words. He did not mind, he reportedly said, what she did, so long as she came back to him in the end. It is easy at this distance to be cruel about George, to call him weak or bought or worse. But that is not quite the truth of it. And this is not a channel that deals in easy cruelty. By the account of his own daughters, the marriage held a real and durable affection. Companionship, one of them called it, of love and laughter. George got something out of the arrangement too, and not only money. He kept his beautiful wife, he kept his comfortable life, and he kept, by simply walking out the door at the right hour, a marriage that might otherwise have shattered. Two people had looked clearly at the world they lived in and made a bargain with it. The bargain simply happened to include a king. In the Portman Square nursery, there were two small girls who knew the heavy, bearded gentleman who came to see their mother only by the name they had given him themselves. They called him Kingy. He would lower himself onto the floor for them, this enormous, breathless heir to the British Empire. There is a story the younger daughter told years afterward of bread and butter slices, buttered on both sides, sat down on the stripes of his trouser leg, and raced from his ankle to his knee, with small bets laid on which slice would slide fastest. To the children of the house, the most powerful man in England was the funny old friend who played on the carpet. They did not know what he was. They did not need to. Their mother had arranged the world so that they would not have to. And the gifts came. Edward gave generously, and Alice received gracefully, and the line between affection and arrangement blurred until it could not be seen at all. At Christmas in the year 1900, she gave him a present in return. A cigarette case from the workshops of Fabergé, the kind of object that cost a fortune, and said, in the silent language of such things, that she understood exactly who he was, and exactly what he liked. It was the perfect gift from the perfect mistress. Beautiful, expensive, discreet. A small enameled box that asked for nothing and gave everything, and revealed by its very flawlessness how completely she had studied him. But the truly important gifts ran the other way, and they were not made of gold. The king, for he would soon be king, saw to it that the woman he loved would not want for money. He could not simply hand her funds from the public purse. Even an Edwardian monarch could not do that. So it was done in the way such things were done, through friends and financiers and quiet arrangements. And with a touch that tells you everything, he sought her husband as well. A good position was found for George Keppel. Comfortable, well paid, conveniently demanding of his time. By the account of the historian Christopher Hibbert, George went cheerfully off to work for the great grocer Sir Thomas Lipton, who found him a place, as Hibbert dryly puts it, at the prince's instigation. Look closely at what that means. The king paid the husband to be elsewhere. The whole apparatus of Alice Keppel's golden life, the house, the income, the husband's salary, the standing in society, flowed directly or indirectly from one man's favor. She was wealthier than she had ever dreamed of being as a girl in that cold Scottish castle. And not 1 pound of it was finally, securely hers. It was all a gift, and a gift, by its nature, can be given back. She did not let herself dwell on that. There was no time and no reason. She was ascending, and the ascent was glorious. She had found the one road her world left open to a woman of her gifts, and she was walking it with a skill that left the competition far behind. The Princess of Wales herself, the gentle, long-suffering Alexandra, seemed almost relieved to have Alice in the part, preferring her tact to the showier mistresses who had come before. For a few more months, it remained what it was, a fashionable affair, brilliantly conducted between a clever woman and a bored old prince. And then, in the early days of 1901, an old woman died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Queen Victoria, who had sat on the throne so long that almost no living Briton could remember another monarch, was gone. The bored old prince was bored no longer. He was the king now. And the woman, in the drawing room at Portman Square, was about to become something for which the English language had no proper title at all. For the next 9 years, Alice Keppel was the most powerful woman in England, who held no office, no title, and no claim to anything at all. The coronation came in the summer of 1902, after an illness nearly killed the new king before he could be crowned. And when Edward VII finally took the throne, the woman at Portman Square rose with him. She did not become queen. There was a queen already, Alexandra. Dignified and deaf and quietly wounded, holding her place with a grace that cost her more than she ever let anyone see. But in the strange double world of the Edwardian court, there was room, it seemed, for something just below a queen. And the court had a name for it, borrowed from the French, who had always been more honest about these things. La Favorite. The favorite. What that meant in practice was power. Real power of a kind that is almost invisible to history because it left so few documents behind. It was exercised in drawing rooms, over bridge tables, in the long unhurried hours after dinner, when the most important conversations in the empire were not held in any chamber of parliament. And in those rooms, the path to the king ran through her. Ministers learned this quickly. The king was clever but impatient, warm but volatile, a man of sudden moods that could harden into stubbornness and ruin an afternoon's diplomacy. And there was exactly one person who could reliably manage him. She knew how to raise a difficult subject lightly. She knew when to press and when to let it lie. She knew how to make him feel that a concession had been his own idea all along. The men who ran the empire came to rely on her, not as a favor, but as a tool of government. We have this not from gossip, but from one of the most senior officials of the age. Sir Charles Hardinge, aide to the king, permanent under, Secretary of the Foreign Office, later Viceroy of India, wrote of it plainly. There were occasions, he recorded, when the king was at odds with his own Foreign Office, and Hardinge was able, through her, to advise the king so that the government's policy might be accepted in the end. Read that again and let its weight settle. The foreign policy of the British Empire, on more than one occasion, was steered through a mistress in a drawing room, because she, and she alone, could turn the king's mind. She used the position, too, for the people she loved. She found a place in the royal household for her own brother. She smoothed paths, opened doors, made introductions that altered careers. She had become, in the space of a few years, a kind of unofficial institution, a clearinghouse for favor and access at the very summit of the empire. And she carried it all so lightly, with such warmth and such apparent effortlessness, that the immense machinery of it was almost never visible. That was the art, to hold real power and to make it look like nothing more than charm, and the money grew to match. Around 1909, the king arranged the most telling gift of all. He could not give her cash from the throne. So instead, on the advice of his great friend and financier, Sir Ernest Cassel, he saw to it that she was given shares, a holding in a rubber company, of all things, in the booming markets of the day. The shares climbed. By the accounts of her biographers, that single arrangement was eventually worth something in the order of 50,000. In the money of our own time, that is several million. A fortune conjured out of the king's favor, and a banker's quiet skill, settled on a woman who had been born without one. She had everything now. The houses filled with the right people. The jewels, the gowns, the holidays in Biarritz each spring, and the yachting weeks at Cowes each summer. The ear of the king. The deference of ministers. The adoration of society. She had taken the only road her world left open to a woman, and she had traveled it to a height almost no one of her sex and her station ever reached. And here is the thing that the photographs of those golden years cannot show you. Every single piece of it rested on the health of one man. There were no settlements in her name that the crown could not unmake. No title that would outlive him. No legal claim, no pension, no protection. The shares were hers, yes, but the world that gave them meaning was not. The houses were grand, but the grandeur was lent. The power was real, but it was held entirely at the pleasure of a heavy, breathless man in his late 60s, who smoked 30 cigarettes and a dozen cigars a day, and whose doctors had begun by 1909 to watch him with quiet alarm. She must have known. A woman that intelligent, that clear-eyed about money and people, could not have failed to know. The whole magnificent structure of her life was built on a single foundation. And the foundation was mortal. But there was nothing to be done about it. And so, as far as the record shows, she did not dwell on it. She went on giving her parties. She went on managing her king. She went on filling rooms with her light, as though the light would never have to go out. In the spring of 1910, the king and his favorite traveled together, as they did every year, to the sun and ease of Biarritz. But the king arrived already unwell. A chill had settled into his chest and would not lift. From there, she wrote a hurried note to a friend, the worry breaking through the careful brightness she usually kept up. The king's cold was so bad, she wrote, that he could not dine out, but he wanted them all there with him at the palace. So be there. And then, almost helplessly, she admitted, quite worried, and had already sent for the nurse. She had managed everything all her life. The men, the money, the moods, the appearances. She had built a kingdom of charm, and held it for 12 years against every rule that should have torn it down. But there was one thing in all the world that Alice Keppel could not manage. And in a few weeks' time, in a hot upstairs room at Buckingham Palace, it was going to be taken out of her hands entirely. The king came home to England at the end of April, and he did not get better. He should have rested. Everyone around him said so. But Edward VII had waited the better part of 60 years for his crown, and he would not be told to lie down now. He kept his appointments. He received his ministers. When his doctors and his household pressed him to stop, he is said to have refused them with the stubbornness that had ruled his whole life. That he would not give in, that he would go on, that he would work to the very end. It is the kind of line that sounds magnificent on the page of a history book. Inside the body of a sick and exhausted man, it was something much closer to a sentence of death. On the 2nd of May, he went out to dine in public for the last time. Alice was there, as she so often was, and by one account, she looked at him across that table, saw how ill he truly was, and quietly sent him home to the palace. It was the instinct of a lifetime to manage him, to protect him, to arrange the world around him so that he need not feel its sharp edges. It was very nearly the last thing she would ever be able to do for him. By the first days of May there was no more pretending. Word was sent abroad to the Queen, to Alexandra, the real Queen, who had been away, and she came hurrying home, arriving on the 5th. By then, her husband was dying. What happened in that upstairs room on the 6th of May is one of the very few genuinely contested moments in this story, and honesty requires us to treat it as exactly that. The bare facts are not in doubt. Near the end, the king asked for Alice Keppel, and the queen, who had borne this woman's presence in her marriage for 12 years with a patience that is difficult to imagine, permitted her to come. Alexandra could be extraordinarily generous. Of her wandering husband, she would say simply, "He loved me the most." She let the mistress into the dying king's room. It is what happened next that the sources cannot agree upon. In the gentler version, the two women wept together, and the queen was kind and even gave her word that the royal family would see Alice cared for. It is worth knowing that this account appears to have come, in large part, from Alice Keppel herself in the years afterward, when the one person left to guard her reputation was her. In the other version, the one most of her biographers have come to accept, the scene went very differently. As the king sank toward unconsciousness, the famous composure of a lifetime finally broke. Alice became distraught and then inconsolable, and the household, with the queen's nerves stretched past their limit, and the king already beyond knowing anyone at all, had to lead the weeping mistress from the room. Some accounts go further and put a sharp, unforgettable command in the queen's mouth: "Get that woman away." Whether those exact words were ever truly spoken, no one can now say. A single source is not proof, but the shape of the scene, the breaking, the removal, is recorded too widely to dismiss. Just after 11 that night, the king died. He was 68. An entire age went into the grave with him and would carry his name forever after. And in that same dark hour, though it would take a little while yet to become visible, the whole magnificent structure of Alice Keppel's life began quietly to fall. 11 days later, they buried him. She was not refused a place at the funeral. That would have been a scandal, and the Edwardians did not permit themselves scandals. She was granted one. But by the account of her biographers, she was admitted to the service through a side door. Apart from the family, apart from the mourning the world was allowed to see. Hold that image, because we placed it before you at the very start. The side door. For 12 years, this had been a woman who mastered the front door, who glided through it into every great house in England, welcomed, adored, made to feel that the evening could not begin without her. And now, on the single day it mattered most, she was let in at the side, quietly, when no one would be troubled by the sight of her grief. It tells you more plainly than any document could exactly what she had always been to them. Not family, not a widow with any right to her sorrow, a guest whose welcome had that week run out. Because it had run out, nearly all of it, and nearly all at once. The new king, George V, was his father's opposite in this, as in so much else. A grave, faithful, conventional man, he had no use whatever for his father's favorite, and he took no pains to hide it. The court closed to her. The invitations thinned and then stopped. The drawing rooms that had once competed for her found all at once that they were quite full. The power that had run through her for a decade now ran elsewhere, because the one man it had ever truly depended upon was lying in the chapel at Windsor. She had not been left poor. The rubber shares were still hers, the income held, but money was never what had made her life extraordinary. The world that had given it all its meaning had simply withdrawn, like a tide going out, and left her standing on the wet sand of an existence that no longer had a center. The gift had been given back, somewhere in the clear, cold part of her mind that understood money and people better than almost anyone. She had always known that it could be, and so Alice Keppel did the only thing a woman of her pride and her intelligence could do. She would not stay to be slowly, courteously forgotten in the city where she had reigned. In November of 1910, only months after the king was buried, the Keppels closed up their English life and left. The reason they gave the world was the education of their daughters. The truer reason needed no announcement at all. There was simply nothing left for her in England. Now she and George would wander for 2 years. The Far East Ceylon, the long, slow distances that put a whole ocean between a person and her grief. But a woman can leave a country. She cannot so easily leave the thing she has been. And the hardest test of who Alice Keppel truly was, harder than the deathbed, harder than the side door, was still waiting somewhere ahead of her. It would not come from the court, or the king, or the world that had just cast her out. It would come from her own daughter. The Keppels came back to England in time for the war. And by the time the world had finished tearing itself apart, the 2 small girls who had once raced bread and butter down the king's trouser leg were small girls no longer. The younger, Sonia, had grown into exactly the daughter her mother might have ordered: quiet, beautiful, conventional. In 1920, she married well and unremarkably into a solid family and disappeared gratefully into an ordinary life. She would give her mother no trouble at all. The elder, Violet, was a different matter entirely, and in Violet, the world was about to test Alice Keppel on the one question that all her charm and all her cunning had never had to answer. Not what she would do for love, what she would do to it. Because Violet was in love, helplessly, furiously, all-consumingly in love, and not with a man. Her name was Vida Sackville West. They had known each other since childhood, since Violet was a girl of 10. Now they were grown women. And what had begun as a schoolroom friendship had become the central fact of Violet's existence. A passion so total that she was prepared, genuinely prepared, to burn her entire world to the ground to live inside it. Vida was married, with a husband and 2 small sons. None of it mattered. For a few extraordinary years, the 2 of them broke every rule there was. They ran away together to France, openly, recklessly. Violet did not want to be discreet. Violet wanted to be free. And that was the one thing her mother could not allow. Consider the terrible shape of it. Here was Alice Keppel, the woman who had spent her whole life outside the rules of marriage. The mistress of a king. The living proof that a clever woman could have love and passion and a double life and lose nothing for it. And here was her daughter, asking for the same freedom in her own way, asking only to love the person she loved. Her mother set out to destroy it. She used everything. The biographer Diana Suhami, who told this story better than anyone, lists the weapons one by one: charm, manipulation, determination, money. The whole arsenal that had conquered a king was now turned at full force on a daughter. First came the marriage. To smother the scandal, Violet was steered into a union with a young officer named Denis Trefusis. A marriage that was from the start very nearly a fiction, entered into by a woman whose heart was somewhere else entirely. It did not hold her. Again and again, Violet tried to break free, to run back to Vita, to be released. And so her mother reached for the last weapon, the one Alice Keppel understood best of all: money. She cut off her daughter's allowance. It was a calculated, surgical cruelty, and it came from a woman who knew precisely what money meant, because money was the very thing that had made her own freedom possible. Take it away, and a woman of Violet's class had nothing. No way to live, no way to flee, no way to build a life outside the one her family permitted. When Violet, in her desperation, talked of divorce, of escape, of poverty, if that was the price of love, her mother is said to have cut her down with a single line. She would be a laughingstock, Alice told her, reduced once more to plain Miss Keppel, a nobody, an object of pity and gossip. Read the cruelty in that, but read the fear underneath it too, because this is the part that turns the story from a simple tale of a hard mother into something far sadder and far more human. Alice Keppel was not protecting some abstract idea of respectability. She was protecting the only thing that had ever protected her. Her entire glittering life, the king, the houses, the fortune, the survival of it all, had rested on one single unbreakable rule. You may do anything. You must never be caught doing it. Discretion was not her hypocrisy. It was her religion. It was the thin, invisible membrane that separated a respected society hostess from a ruined woman. And now her own child was tearing that membrane to shreds in public, for the whole world to see, and seemed not even to understand what she was risking. What Alice could not say, perhaps could not even let herself think, was the cruelest truth of all. She was demanding that her daughter live, alive because a lie was the thing that had saved her own life. She was punishing Violet for wanting honestly what Alice had only ever been allowed to have in secret. In the end, the mother won. Of course she won. She had broken kings to her will. A heartbroken daughter was no match for her at all. The affair was slowly, methodically crushed. Vida went back to her husband and her sons, and in time to a kind of peace. And Violet was the one left broken. She did not die of it. People rarely do. She lived a long time, in fact. But by her biographer's account, something in her went quiet after that. In her later years, she became, of all the sorrowful things she might have become, a parody of her own mother. Living in grand houses, giving lavish parties, flirting with princes, telling beautiful and flamboyant lies. She built, around the ruin of the one true thing she had ever wanted, an imitation of the very woman who had taken it from her. It is the saddest ending of all. Not death. Just a slow surrender into becoming the thing that broke you. This was the real cost of Alice Keppel's golden life. And it was not paid by Alice. It was paid by her daughter. The discretion that had carried the mother to the side of a throne became the cage that held the daughter for the rest of her days. And the woman at the center of it would never quite see it that way. To the end of her life, Alice Keppel believed she had done the right thing, the necessary thing. She had played the world by its rules and won, and she could not understand a child who refused to play at all. She had given her parties. She had managed her king. She had saved herself again and again from every danger but one. She had never once learned how to let someone she loved be free. In 1925, Alice and George Keppel bought a villa on a hill above Florence. It was called the Villa del Ombrellino, and it stood in Bellosguardo among cypresses, looking down over the red roofs and the river and the great dome of the city. It was an old and storied place. Galileo himself was said to have lived there once 3 centuries before, watching his own stars from those same hills. And here, in the long Italian light, the last great Edwardian mistress made herself a kingdom in miniature. She did the only thing she had ever truly known how to do. She gave perfect parties. To the terrace gardens of the Ombrellino came the exiled kings and queens of half of Europe, the dethroned, the displaced, the leftover royalty of a world the Great War had swept away. A young Winston Churchill came to paint, and Alice presided over it all exactly as she once had over Edwardian London, gracious and luminous and entirely in command. An uncrowned queen, reigning over a court of other people's lost thrones. There is something almost unbearably fitting in that. She had spent her whole life beside power that belonged to someone else. Now she spent her last decades among people who had once held real crowns and held them no longer. And she, who had never held one at all, was somehow the most regal figure among them. She never lost the old certainties. In December of 1936, news reached the world that the king's own grandson, Edward VII, had given up the throne of England to marry a divorced woman he loved, and in a restaurant, the Ritz. By most accounts, the old mistress of his grandfather was overheard delivering her verdict on the whole modern business in a single, dry, devastating sentence. "Things," she said, "were done much better in my day. You may smile at that. Many people have. But underneath the wit is the whole of her creed and the whole of her tragedy. In her day, a king kept his throne and his love both, and the world looked politely away. In her day, you did not blow up your life for passion. You arranged it, you managed it, you kept the surface bright." She had built her life on that principle and crushed her own daughter's heart to defend it, and she would go to her grave believing to the last that she had been right. The end came in Florence in September of 1947. After the Second War had been weathered and the Keppels had come home to their hill. Alice died of a failing liver at 79. She had been married to George for 56 years. He did not last without her. Just over 2 months later, George Keppel died too, the complacent husband, the man who had spent a lifetime stepping quietly out of rooms so that his wife could shine in them. After 56 years of making way for her, it seems he could not find the way to go once she was gone. They were buried together in the same foreign soil, beneath the cypresses of a city that had never been theirs. 2 graves side by side, an ocean away from the country where she had reigned. And there, for a long time, the story of Alice Keppel was allowed to rest, quietly in the margins. The side door of history, a scandalous footnote to a king's reign. A name the great families preferred to leave unspoken. But history, it turns out, keeps strange accounts. And it does not always close them when we think it has. For the throne that Alice Keppel could never touch, the crown she stood beside for 12 years and was never, for one single day, permitted to share, was not finished with her bloodline. She had 2 daughters. The wild one, Violet, had no children. Her grief ended with her. But the quiet one, Sonia, the beautiful daughter, the one who gave no trouble, the one who married well and vanished into ordinary life. Sonia had a daughter of her own. And that daughter had a daughter. A girl born in the very year Alice Keppel died, who would grow up to fall in love, in her turn, with a Prince of Wales, who would wait through decades of scandal and exile of her own. And who would at last, against every prediction, marry her king. A century after the side door, Alice Keppel's own great-granddaughter would stand in Westminster Abbey and be crowned Queen of England. It is the kind of ending no novelist would dare to write. The position the mistress could never have. The dignity she was denied at a funeral. The place at the very center, in the full light, with nothing hidden and no side door at all. History gave it, in the end, to the blood of the woman it had cast out, and gave it openly, and gave it a crown. Alice Keppel never knew. She had been in her grave for 2 years before the child was even born. She died believing she had played a brilliant game and won everything a woman of her world could win, and lost only the things that did not finally count. She was wrong about her daughter. She was wrong about the cost, but about her own strange, borrowed, brilliant life. Perhaps, in the end, she was not so wrong. After all, she had reached for a crown she could never hold. And 100 years later, in a way she could never have dreamed, the reaching came true.